afternoon, and thank you for joining us today on this kind of interesting episode of Wall Dropping History. It's going to be kind of an unusual one because the tone is going to be obviously particularly dark. Some heavy topics talked about today. But we're going to try and break it all down. And so today's topic is going to be the history of bound labor. Now, I actually took a college class on this in college, and it's taken on a lot of different forms. We're going to break down what bound labor is, how it's changed over the years, what are some different ways it's happened, so on and so forth. Before we get to that, I do want to get to the agenda. A lot of y'all have been sending in your talents. Look, I've been blown away. Like, in fact, we had a meeting with the school today, and I showed Quinn's talent, and they all really loved it. Which, by the way, I meant to ask you if you wouldn't mind putting in the comments. Do you mind if I share that on social media? Because that was really fun to watch. But yeah, so send in your talents. I love to have that on tomorrow's episode. Before we get going, though, I do want to point out too to tell you about our ability to now put in grades. We are now able to put grades into J Campus. So do me a favor, if you are following along with these shows, do me a favor and make sure any of the live streams you've done, any work you've done, just hit submit in Google Classroom. Okay? Just go ahead and hit submit in Google Classroom so that way I know to make sure you're awarded the points. Now, I can go back and look and see if you did participate, but that just kind of speeds up my process to be able to look for your work. And I don't want to spoil. I asked Nirali, what was her talent. I don't want to spoil it. I want it to kind of be a surprise for tomorrow because when I saw that, it was just blowing my mind. Like, wow, I'm not even going to say any more about it. It was really fun to watch. And a lot of the artwork's been really good. Somebody's played music. So I've had some really good... wait for tomorrow. It's going to be really good. I'm excited. I'm really excited about tomorrow's episode. But let me tell you this, too. Make sure you show up live because, on these culture days, they always take that video down. It's got too much music, too many movie clips. They're going to take that thing down, maybe in the middle of it. I don't know. So, just be prepared for that. If it does, I plop right back on and we go right back into it. But just know to show up live because we're probably not going to... I might try to see if I can record it so I can put it in Google Classroom and do it, let y'all see it that way. But anyway, so that's going on. And again, any of those live streams you've done, please go back and just hit submit so that I know you did them. Let's go over the agenda real fast. So Monday was the history of civilization. Tuesday was the Mongols. That's the one where I dressed up as Genghis Khan. Wednesday was Pandemic Wednesday. Today is bound labor, and tomorrow is the culture of the 2010s. Oh, I guess I've jumped way ahead of myself. Thank you for joining us today on Wall Dropping History. I'm your host, Mr. Waldrop. I have today with me my co-host, Elizabeth Waldrop, and she's here in the saddle with me to help me out on today's episode of Wall Dropping History. So that's all the announcements I have for today. I'm really excited about tomorrow. And again, I may not have an episode on Monday. I don't know. I'm going to try to get as many grades as I can done this weekend. I want to say we're not going to have an episode on Monday, but to be brutally honest, I love doing this so much, I might have one anyway. So we'll see how much grading I can get done during the interim. And let me give some shout-outs to everybody. Thank you for joining us. Quinn, Raleigh, Jayla, let's see what else, Mr. Raby, Bushra, and, of course, Mrs. Waldrop hopping in there, facilitating the chat as well. I said Jayla. Yeah. So thank you all so much for showing up. I'm glad you decided to dedicate some time today to your education. So just a refresher, any makeup work you do, I can give you up to a B on it, and any enrichment work you do is just pure bonus. So great opportunity. Oh, one other thing too. I did talk to Mr. Bradford. Let's hypothetically say you get to an A, and you're like, well, what's the point of showing up, right? Why should I show up? Actually, Ms. Patel's the one that kind of got this ball rolling as far as me asking about this. I got his permission so that if you, which by the way, we're doing more world history now because that's the class you're going to go into next year. Any work you show up for enrichment, if you have an A, it can go as bonus to next year. So you will hop into world history next year with some bonus points. So, let's say you have an A, it's just padding your stats for next year. So that's a great opportunity for a lot of students. So thank you to Miss Nurali for getting that ball rolling. You can thank her for that. All right, so let's talk about the history of bound labor. Okay, so to begin with, what is bound labor, right? So bound labor is basically when somebody is forced to do labor for somebody else, right? We're not talking about me paying the kid next door to come mow my lawn. That's not bound labor. But there's a lot of gray area between what is bound labor and what is free labor. So, for example, if I tell Elizabeth to go wash the dishes, okay, that is technically bound labor because I'm not asking, I'm telling, right? Now, she does get compensated for that, right? Like we take her out and we buy her food and, she gets free room and board and all that stuff, cell phone, yeah. So, there's a lot of gray area between what is bound labor and what is not bound labor. The best thing I can think of to give you an example. So what is free labor, right? Free labor was me deciding to be a teacher, right? That was free labor. I could have continued to work in the restaurant industry. I probably would be making more money in the restaurant industry. There was a point in time where I was making more money working in restaurants than I make as teacher, right? And I could have gone down that path. I know a lot of people I worked with in restaurants are making way more money than me. In fact, I know somebody that used their restaurant experience to open a catering business. And my sister runs a catering business, right? And they're making way more money than me, right? Like way more money.
So you would expect teachers to make more because they teach you how to do that.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, and it didn't require college education, right? Didn't require college education. For me to work in a restaurant. But let me tell you this, and by the way, thank you for joining us, Aaliyah. Glad you could join us. But let me tell you this, I hated it. I hated working in restaurants. I didn't feel like I was contributing to society. I'm not saying that people that work in restaurants are not, but me personally, I have that like innate desire to, I don't know, have my legacy carry on type thing,
You want other
I'm not changing the world one French fry at a time,
people
right?
to be like affected.
Right. So I kind of made that joke of would I choose to go to Mars if I knew it was a one-way trip, because I love the idea of leaving that legacy going on. Oh, it's thunderstorm. Yeah, it's not even raining here. I went out and jogged this morning, and I thought the sky was going to rip open, but fortunately it did not. But anyway, so. Yeah, so that is an example of free labor. My choice to work in education as opposed to working in a restaurant. So, yeah. So here's something. What is something you were forced to do that you do not want to do?
The dishes.
Okay, so for Elizabeth, it's the dishes.
I hate doing the dishes.
For Elizabeth, it's the dishes. I know for my son, it's taking the garbage out.
I took the garbage out already.
Good job, Joe.
I really like doing the dishes.
Doing the dishes.
It's disgusting.
Putting up your laundry, that's one.
No, because y'all still have, leave food on it, and then y'all get water in it, and so it's watery food. I don't like it.
Well, let me tell you, not too much later from where you are, when I was 16, I got a job doing washing dishes at a Mexican restaurant.
That
and
I will never
let me tell you this, you have not seen nasty dishwashing until you have scrubbed refried beans out of a pan. That's a whole nother level, right? Feed your dogs every day. English class, cut grass.
Oh, we do.
Let's see. Rachel said doing the chores the kids didn't do. Yeah, so we all have to do things we don't want to do, right? Okay, so that is in its essence bound labor. So there's a gray area to what exactly is bound labor, right? So bound labor is when you're forced to do work against your will, right?
Like homework?
Like homework, right? So if you're a kid and you're forced to do homework. Now, there's a lot of grayness too, for example, when wages are very low, right? So there's a lot of people right now going to work at Walmart. And it kind of blurs the line between bound labor, right? So, there's a lot of people, I'm sure, that say go to work at Walmart that don't want to go to work. They're afraid for their life. Maybe they have pre-existing conditions. They're terrified for their life, but what's the alternative? Starve to death?
They're terrified that they're going to give it to their kids.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a big gray area. Healthcare workers. Let me tell you this right now. There's no amount of money. Miss Nikki and Mr. Hitesh, and I'm sure that somebody is knocking at my door and the dog is going crazy. But I am sure. Can you let the dogs out, please? Yeah. No, not at the front door, Joe. At the back door. At the back door. No, let's not sick the dogs on the neighbors. But
go get a voice.
Let's say, for example, you take the two of them, for example. What they're doing is an incredible feat, right? Going out there, risking their lives to try to help the betterment of mankind, right? However, there's a lot of people out there that probably, maybe they're elderly, or maybe they're, they themselves have some health conditions. It might be the UPS guy. So there's a lot of situations where they might be fearful of their lives, but they're forced to go out and work anyway, right? Because somebody's got to be out there. So there's a lot of blurriness on what exactly is bound labor and what is not bound labor, right? Like, I don't think any kid, when Mr. Raby's feeding his dogs, I don't think he's walking up to his parents going, this is slave labor. How dare you make me do this, right? So there's a lot of gray area on what exactly is bound labor, right? Today we're not going to talk about those gray areas. We're going to talk about unquestionably bound labor, right? If there's a black and white, we're dealing with the stuff that's clearly in the boat of bound labor, right? We're not talking about, and let me tell you this, we're going to deal with some adult concepts, right? So we're not talking about maybe somebody that is doing adult, how do you put it, that are maybe in the adult film industry because they're starving to death, or maybe somebody that is forced to do drug running because they're afraid for their life or something like that. We're not talking about those gray areas where it's like it's semi-voluntary, like nobody makes anybody become a drug dealer, but they may be in a situation where societal ills pressure them into it. We're not dealing with that stuff. We're talking about picking cotton, right? Like unquestionably bound labor, right? So, what is an example you already know of slavery, right? So, obviously, the most obvious one that I'm sure some of y'all put into comments is slavery in the Deep South, right? Out there picking cotton with the guy slashing the whip. Can you think of any other examples that you've read about in history of slavery?
In Egypt,
let my people go, right? I mean, that's Exodus.
They were having to build the pyramids, I'm pretty sure.
Right. Exodus. The second book of the Bible is the story about Moses freeing the slaves, right? So, it goes back to the dawn of recorded history, examples of slave labor, right? So, do y'all have any other ones that y'all may know about? Whether it's ancient Egypt, some other examples, obviously slavery in the Deep South. Do y'all know any other ones? Examples of slavery?
We were talking about something like the day before yesterday, and it set the example for other people to do it for slavery. I can't remember what it was like.
I don't know.
It was the dawn of civilization one, or it was the Mongols. I don't know.
Yeah, the Mongols definitely had slaves. In fact, and we're going to talk about this in a little while. They were the ones that came up with the what is known as the wagon wheel rule, which is anybody that was taller than a wagon wheel, you just cut their head off, and then you enslave the children. Yeah, because it's and we're going to get into all that later. So in the very beginning, bound labor is very rare, right? So Quinn points out, when they went to Indonesia, and they forced the men to run out and be used as target practice. Yeah, and of course, remember we talked about the raping of Nanking, where they forced all the women into sex slavery. Yeah, absolutely. Great example. Yeah, that's a great example from class. Good job on that one. Okay, so in the beginning, people are very nomadic, right? And slavery is very rare. Usually, if you come to another tribe and you get into a fight with them, you just kill them, or you end the skirmish and move on, right? So in the very beginning of time, slavery is very rare. Slavery is going to come out of once you start having that Neolithic revolution, which we talked about earlier, that dawn of civilization, right? Where people are no longer hunter-gatherers, they're starting to settle, they're building society. Then you're going to start to have the very first examples of slave labor or bound labor. So my kind of question to you is, why do you think mankind came up with bound labor?
Because they're lazy and they don't want to do it themselves, or because they're rich and they think that they're above that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, right? So you think about the dawn of civilization, right? You know, if you're talking about a tribe, you may have had a chieftain that kind of had all the birds flying in one direction. But as a general rule, there wasn't this complex social hierarchy of a power structure, right? Once you start having civilization, you're going to have that, right?
Yeah, it's like the king, and then it's like the noble people, then it's like the knights, and then it's like the peasants, and then below that is the slaves.
Right, and so as you start having that, and you start having that power structure, I kind of always think back to that total power corrupts totally, you know, or absolute power corrupts absolutely. You know, you start having like these really corrupt leaders that are able through bureaucracy to maintain their power, right? If the chieftain of the tribe is acting a fool, you just kill the chieftain, right? Mm-hmm. But, you know, if for example, the Kim Jong-un is acting a fool, well, the Korean people don't have the mechanisms to remove him of power. Was there ever when Caucasians are enslaved? I'm glad you asked that, Rachel, because we're going to talk about a period of history in which we had white slaves. So we are going to talk about that, right? Let's see. They think they're rich and have the power to be able to do whatever they want. That's right. They think they are overpowered. Oh, New Orleans is under a tornado watch. Ugh. Yeah, be safe. Be careful. If you got to leave and go take shelter, don't die for the wall drop in history. Definitely don't do that. So, yeah.
Get in your basement if you have it.
Yeah. Okay, so the first recorded example of slavery would happen in ancient Mesopotamia, in the Samar Kingdom. Joe, take that back to your room. Now, this would date as far back as 3500 BCE, right? Which, going back to that other lesson, that stands for before Common Era, right? Before we had recorded history. Yeah, there's a level of sadistic feelings mixed in. That's absolutely true. Now, the outline for slavery is established under the Code of Hammurabi, right, which is our first ever written recorded laws. Right? Now, I'm not saying it was the first ever time mankind created rules, but the oldest slab of recorded law, you know, where it was like a bureaucratic law, is the Code of Hammurabi. In it, and I want you to read this quote. This is a quote from the Code of Hammurabi. It says, "If anyone finds a runaway male or female slaves in open country and bring them into their masters, the master of the slave shall pay him 2 shekels of silver." So it was basically outlining how to bring in slaves to the slave master. And this is the earliest recorded law, right? Yeah, the Hammurabi. And we're not talking about, what was that gorilla's name that they shot? Was it Hammurabi? I think, I don't know. Anyway, but it's not that, right?
I didn't know they shot a gorilla.
Yeah, it was a big deal made out of the gorilla that got shot. I can't remember the gorilla's name. Anyway. Okay, so slavery at the time is mostly the form of voluntary servitude. Most of the slaves could typically own land, marry, etc., right? So it's not slavery like you think now. And I'm not saying there weren't examples of that, but most slaves were, hey, I'm down on my luck, I don't know how to farm, I don't have any land, I can't survive, I'm going to go to this guy and say, hey, I'm going to voluntarily become a slave for you, work for you on your farm, you have basically a 3-year contract with that person where you're their slave. But you can still own property, you can still get married, blah, 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 there's not some guy out there whipping you. But you're bound to service for him, and you can't break that contract, right? The news was just going to watch out. Oh yeah, be careful flooding. So it's not slavery like you think, right? It would almost be like if you decided, like, okay, I want to go be an essential worker and go out and work, right? So you go and you get a job at Target. but you sign a job where you're with Target for, say, 3 years. And during that period of time, you can be forced to do whatever they tell you to do. You know, whether it is cashier, mop the floor, tile the roof, it don't matter, right? Whatever they ask you to do, you got to do it. And you can't get out of it either, right? There's no way out.
You just quit your job.
No, you can't quit your job. That's what I'm saying. You're not allowed to quit for, let's say, 3 years. And it could be 7 years, something like that, right? So no matter what they ask you to do, you are not allowed to quit. Yeah. So, but during that course of time, you still can own property and get married, blah, blah, blah. So that's the first kind of example of that, right? Oh, that's Hammurabi, the gorilla. Never mind. So why do you think somebody would choose to become a slave? Why would that be somebody would choose?
Well, I'm guessing if you're a slave, they do feed you, right?
Well, a lot of times it's you can still earn some kind of wages, or you're right, you can sometimes live on the property and be fed and stuff like that. Yeah.
And sometimes you just need a place to sleep.
Right.
Eat.
I often think, if I was alive during the time of the Code of Hammurabi, and let's say, for example, I didn't have any real skill, I didn't own any land, and you and Joe were alive. Oh, you better believe I would go be a slave. I wouldn't want to, but I'd do it. If that's what it took to put food on the plate to take care of you and your brother. Yeah, so it might be a situation that just maybe they don't have, not everybody can be a farmer, or has the land to farm. So yes, a lot of times it's the lesser of two evils, if you will, right? Yeah, if you're poor and have nothing, and so there's a lot of examples we see that even today, where I think you see this a lot today, where somebody leaves the prison system and they're a felon, and they want to get their life straight, but they get out there and nobody will hire them, and the only way they know how to make money is dealing drugs, so they go right back into the game that got them there. So that's an example of.
You gotta do what you gotta do to put.
Even though you were a slave, you can still own property, marry slaves. Yeah. I mean, it's usually the lesser of two bad decisions, right? Now, the next major example of slavery we're going to talk about is slavery in ancient Egypt, right? So that's if you're a Judeo-Christian or Islamic or Jewish, they all kind of share the same Old Testament, and it kind of goes all the way back to the slaves in Egypt, right? So slavery is very common in the Middle East, right, which is the first recorded case. Ancient Mesopotamia is in the Iraq area. So it goes all the way back then. And so the slave laborers used in ancient Egypt was the Jewish population, right? Of course, we all know the stories, if you're someone who's a believer of the faith of Moses leading his people out of Egypt, right? If you're a believer of the faith of Judeo-Christianity or Judaism or Islam, that belief that, and there's a lot of recorded evidence, even if you were somebody who's atheist, that there was at one point in time Jewish, and the Egyptians talked about it too, that they did have Jewish slaves that, however your faith leads you to believe, did manage to get out of their bond servitude. Although it should be a funny note, one of the first things they do is go right back to having their own system of slavery. So, why do you think Egypt needed so many slaves?
Because they were trying to build the pyramids, and they thought that they were too rich, and they were too above being able to
Right. Well, and it's not just the pyramids too. The Sphinx. There's a lot of tombs, a lot of structures they built before then.
They thought they needed slaves because they were above that. I don't want to get my hands dirty because I'm above.
Right. Yeah. I mean, big projects, right, going on. You're not going to make something like the Pyramid of Giza. And let me tell you this. Not all labor was slave labor, right? So the pyramids weren't just built by slaves. There's a lot of slave labor involved, but some people were just workers and they worked on slaves. I guarantee the guy that mapped out the design for it, I doubt he was a slave. And then you're also going to see slaves in Egypt that rise up in power to be, what do you call it? Viziers, advisors, right? So, like, if you read the book of Daniel,
Like,
talks about him being like a guy that's like
like in
an advisor to the pharaoh.
like a vizier to like the sultan, like in Aladdin.
Yeah, like that, right? Like, so Jafar, he talks about, at one point in time he was just a commoner, and he rose up to be the vizier. Even though you were a slave, you can still, they needed many people to help for big projects. That's right.
Didn't they obey Hammurabi's code because they thought Hammurabi was chosen by the gods?
They definitely believe he had this divine wisdom to him, right? Okay, so as the Muslim faith would grow in the Arab world, slave trade would begin to grow with it. And part of that is due to Sharia law, which allows for the, just like the Code of Hammurabi, the Sharia law allows for slavery. Now, here's where you're going to see a change for the first time, though. Part of the Islamic faith, though, is you can kind of build up, what is the right word? Blessings, if you will. Like, it's a good thing for you in Islam to free slaves, right? Like, one of the things that in, say, what is it? Like in Hinduism, for example, is to respect life, right? That builds up your karma for your next life, right? Or in Buddhism, right?
Yeah, I remember there was one religion where they thought that whenever you died and you're like reborn, you can come back as like a different thing, like an animal or something like that, and so they just like wouldn't kill animals because they thought
right. So this is the first time you're going to see it where it's like it's seen as a religiously good thing, like you're building up religious cred, if you will, for the act of freeing slaves, right? So, one of the things I think about is, and by the way, the Arab slave trade would have as many as 15 million slaves, right? So, massive amount of slave trade, right? So, one of the things I wanted to ask was, how do you think a religion that promoted the freeing of slaves helped make it popular? So, what do you think?
Because if everybody's that religion, then nobody's going to want to have slaves.
Yeah, I said.
So make sure you mention that.
Yeah.
That conversion. Then you also try to help that conversion.
Right. Why do you think that the religion of promoting freeing of slaves made it more popular?
Well, if one person is that religion, then their family has to be that religion. If their family has friends, then their friends are going to become that religion, and their families, and then their friends, and their families, and their friends, and
right.
eventually well, everybody's that religion.
Let me point out a couple things. One, part of their faith was you could not enslave another Muslim. Okay, so that helped spread the faith too, right? There's a lot of people that would convert because they didn't want to be slaves, right? There's also, I think, the aspect too of if you are a slave and a Muslim person, because this would happen a lot in the Muslim world, they would buy a slave, and to build up goodwill on earth for heaven, they would buy slaves and free them. How do you think that would have an impact on a slave? If let's say you were a slave to, let's say, somebody else, right? And an Islamic person were to come along and buy you as a slave and then free you. How do you think that impacts you?
Well, like, if I was, like, at first, like, if I didn't know that they were going to free me, like, if I was just being, like, if they were just going to buy me, I'd probably be, like, upset at first, because I'm like, what? I don't want to be bought by someone. It's like, that's kind of like...
But knowing that they were buying you with the purpose of freeing you.
Yeah, buying you with the purpose of freeing you. I think that would, like, change it, because, like, you think, like, after all of that work, I'm finally going to be free again, and I can finally maybe see my family again if they're not too far away.
Right. The thing I think about it is, if you think about it, if you were a slave and somebody out of the kindness of their heart bought you and then freed you,
I would want to be their religion.
Yeah, it would make you think, man, I like this religion. Yeah, I like this religion.
I wouldn't know everything about them.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that makes Islam incredibly popular. Because you got to think about it. So if they're now freed, you can imagine a lot of them would convert and them themselves want to free slaves, right? So that's kind of a very goodwill thing for the Islamic faith to kind of spread this notion of the freeing of slaves, right? Yeah, Rafe said he'd be happy if he was set free. Because it would be a religion. The freeing of slaves would do it because they did not want to go against their religion, right? Now, as the Ottoman Empire grew, so did slavery. However, with the Ottomans, you start seeing the rise of sex slavery. Remember, I said we're going to deal with some adult themes in here. They even had a class called the Cole, which were slaves that achieved a notable position, right? So think about like Jafar, right? These are slaves that they started becoming educated. They recognize, like, he may be a slave, but this guy's got a good head on his shoulders. We read about in the book of Daniel, how he's cast out, he's rised up. So they would have this special class called the Cole, which are kind of educated, smart. They're still slaves, but they give good advice, and their advice is taken into it. What do you think a king would want a slave for an advisor? What would be the benefit of having an advice from a slave?
Like how you like it whenever I do the shows. Like you're like I know I'm closer to the age of your students than
Oh.
So like I kind of would understand it on like their level type thing.
You're easier to relate to for the students than me, who's a 40-year-old guy and grew up in a different era. Yeah, absolutely, right? So, if you look at it from that standpoint, if you were a slave and you came up in the slave world, you probably better than most understand the mentality of the person on the bottom, the perspective of the little guy, right? And that's very important for a king, right? To be able to understand and kind of get the sentiment on the ground, right? Yeah, they would have a wisdom that's a great way to put it. They would have a wisdom that the king simply couldn't have, right? He just cannot. You can empathize, but you just cannot understand, right? One of the things that even me as a teacher, teaching at Broadmoor, I've encountered students like this. I have never in my life laid my head on a pillow and gone to bed at night and not felt safe. Well, I'm not talking about like from a hurricane or something like that. I'm talking like afraid that other people might do me harm, right? That there might be violence in my neighborhood or something like that. I don't know what that's like. I have no taste of that world, and I know a lot of my students do. They go to bed at night not knowing where somebody is going to break into their home or try to hurt them in some way, shape, or form. I'll tell you right now, this COVID-19 thing has been scary for me. It's hard for me to go to sleep. Because for the first time in my life, on a daily basis, I go to sleep not knowing that everybody I care about is going to be safe. And so it's hard to have that perspective, right?
Because people who want to provide food for people,
right,
for their family, they'll do crazy things.
Right. And there are good kings that want to do right by their people, right? That think about legacy and how they'll be remembered. That did exist, right? So that provides an invaluable resource. They would, let's see, Joe writes, they would want to know, they would want the people would want because they would relate to them more. Absolutely. Quinn writes, they would have more thinking of the people than the king would have. Absolutely. All great points. Okay. So in Asia, the first recorded cases of slavery would occur out of India, and I hope I'm pronouncing this word, the Dasa, I think is how you pronounce it, right? And this would be chronicled by Alexander the Great as he started coming over there, conquering lands over in India. It would be as documented as early as 356 BCE. The thing I think about is, and maybe y'all don't even know about this, but in India they have something called the caste system, right? So there's very unofficial levels of social hierarchy here in America, right? So we have what is called the poor, then we have the middle class, then you have the upper class, and then you have the rich, and then you have the billionaire class, right? But there's no well-defined, what's the difference between being poor and middle class? That it's hard to make that distinction of, I guarantee you right now there's people walking around that think they're middle class and they're not. They live in poverty. They don't even get the difference, right? There's people that think that they're middle class and they're really rich, right? It's not well defined. India has a social hierarchy that is very well defined, right? Where it's like, if you're in this class, matter of fact, let me bring it up here and bring it over. Open image tab. Okay, so let me bring it up over here. So this is the caste system, right? So it would be like the untouchables would be down here, right? The slaves and stuff like that. These are street sweepers. The guy that cleans out the urinal. I mean, the bottom rung, right? Then you have the peasants, commoners, servants, merchants, landowners, warriors, kings, and the very top would be like your religious leaders, right? And so it's a very huge.
Wait, so you would be at the very top because you have, because it says academics.
You got to realize the vast majority of the world could not read or write during this time.
So you'd be at the top, Dad.
Well, the question is, if I was born in this era, would I ever be able to make it there? It ain't easy to get up this high. If I'm born here, this is probably where I'd be born. I'd probably die right here. Maybe make it up to here, but I'd never just jump up to here.
Well,
right?
You could be a landowner.
Probably would not happen, right? If you go ask Baji about it sometime. The still today, the holdover of how important the caste system plays in the daily life, right? So it still plays this thing. So how do you think it fit in with the caste system? Having slaves.
The caste system having this, I'm trying to think.
Well, we talked about in the Islamic world how it was possible for slaves to move up. But if you're in a caste system, how do you think that makes it work? Even if you were freed, you would very likely...
no one would want to be around you type thing.
Nerali says she's... pardon me if I mispronounce this. Vishaya, I think is how you say it. Vishaya, yeah. So I was not under the assumption that you were a king, warrior, priest, academic. Yeah, so I mean that is on that hierarchy, right? So if she wanted to be the king of India, which they don't have a king, but it'd be very difficult for her to do that, right? Because even if there was a king who wanted her as a wife, the social stigma of marrying outside of the caste system is huge over there, right? The same thing is Vishaya. But it would be the same thing, like if she were to marry somebody whose job it was to scrub toilets. That would also be shunned upon, right? So the thing I think about it would fit in the caste system in that if you were a slave, even if you became free, it's going to be very hard for not only you, but even your children to ever rise up. Right? It's almost like once a slave, always a slave.
Yeah.
So that adds that extra layer of lack of social mobility, right?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. I just couldn't think of how to say it.
Right.
I had once a slave, always a slave in my head, but I couldn't figure out how to put it into words.
Okay, so going further east in 221 BCE, right? So keep in mind BCE works backwards, right? So 3000 BCE came before 2000 BCE. So we're even though the numbers are counting down, we're progressing forward in history, right? Yeah. So in around 221 BCE, the
it goes to 0, and then it goes up.
Right. The Qin dynasty would have records of slaves. They used slavery as a means of law enforcement. Okay, so for them it was law enforcement. So one example would be, this is an example, would be let's say you were caught having raped somebody. If you were raped in this era and you were found to be a rapist, what they would do is first castrate you, which meant remove your genitalia. Yeah, it's not fun. And a lot of people, I'm sure, died doing this. They would remove your genitalia so that you could never rape someone again. And then you would be turned into a slave. And you would be a slave to the family of the person whom you raped. So now you're their property, right? And that's an extreme example. It could be other things too. Like let's say you broke in somebody's house and you stole their toaster. Well, you might be their slave for 4 months as recompense. If you murdered their spouse, you might be their slave for life, right? So it depends. It's like one of those. What's the punishment, right?
Imagine being a slave to someone and you killed someone with their family. You'd be actually scared.
Well, if they want to, they could torture you. That's their right. If they, you're their property.
Crippity crap.
Right. It's almost one of those now the punishment is up to the person whom you did it, right? So if somebody came to the house and let's say stole something from me, right? They're my slave for 6 months, say. I could use them as bound labor if I wanted to. If I don't want to feed them, I don't have to feed them.
I would feel really bad.
Yeah, well, let me tell you this too, Rachel. If, let's say, for example, somebody did harm to my family, I don't have to have them show up in the house and do the dishes. If let's say they murdered somebody in my family, if it was my prerogative, they could be my slave and I could take them out in the field and chop their head off. They're my property now, and I can do with them as I see fit. So it almost adds the decision out of the courts too, because you got to realize there's no courts per se.
Did anyone wound up killing themselves because they didn't want to be a slave?
Oh, I'm sure there was. Hey, can you lower the AC? It's hot in here. Yeah. It's one of those. You got to think of it in these terms too. There's no prisons, right? There's nowhere to take all these people. Like, let's say you murder or rape somebody. There's no jails and prisons. Turn the fan on. Stuff like that. So it's kind of the first kind of thought process of have to have slavery. But let's go away from the extreme example, right? Let's say, for example, somebody did something like try to break into my house, right? It might be a scenario where I could say, okay, now they're my slave. I can make them go get a job at Target, but I collect their paycheck for 4 months, right? Something like that. So there's different ways you could do it, right? They're your property. You could see as do them as you see fit. Well, yeah, obviously you got to be found 100% guilty, right? Absolutely. Now, as the Han took over, slavery became more and more common and easier to be forced into. They would actually end up using it as when they would go to conquer other places, they would begin to take their people as slaves. One of the main things that the Han Dynasty would do is they set their sights on Vietnam, and basically they would say, oh, these Vietnamese women, they sure are pretty. We're going to go down there and conquer Vietnam and force the Vietnamese women into sex slavery. And that's where you're going to start to see it take that really nasty turn of incorporating sex slaves. So that's going to come out of the Han Dynasty. Now, this is going to be further expanded on, and we talked about this earlier in the show, with Genghis Khan. Yeah. He would go into neighboring areas, and he would have something called the wagon wheel rule. Now, why would he do that? So, let's say you're a 30-year-old man. Why would he cut your head off? He would cut your head off because if you're a 30-year-old guy and you're made into a slave, and let's say there's a lot of slaves, they're not loyal to Genghis Khan. They're not loyal to the Mongols. They don't want to be slaves. But if they're a kid and they're put into slavery, well, that's all they know. They don't know of life of freedom, right? So they would do this thing called a wagon rule. Let me see if I can show it to you. See if I can show it to you. Well, let's just do this. Wagon wheel. Okay, so basically something like this, right? So you'd stand up to it, and if your head went over the wagon wheel, they chopped it off. right, to make sure that they didn't have to deal with insurrections and stuff like that. So I guess it'd be very beneficial to be a short person. But anyway, so they would take all the children and raise them as slaves, and they would a lot of times take the women and use them as sex slaves under the Mongols. Now the Mongols would use total war, and again, all the adult males they just killed. Right? There's no reason to keep prisoners. They didn't have jails. Just kill them. Right? Slavery was for the children and the women they captured. And the knowledge of this came from the writings of Marco Polo, right? Not the game you play in the pool. There was actually an explorer named Marco Polo. And I think my first year teaching, I had a student ask me, how did we get the name for the game? You know, the game you play in the pool with Marco Polo. And as much as I looked, I could never find a legitimate source that wasn't just speculation. So I don't know. I don't know how we got that name. But that's how we know about it under the Mongols. So the question I asked is, why do you think they would use kids for slaves? And I kind of already spoiled it, but why do you think? Why would they use children for slaves?
Because, like, it was, like, if you're a child and you grow up in slavery, it's the only thing you know. Like, you don't know otherwise.
Right.
Like, if I was born to, like, a really rich family, and then they gave me up because, like, they couldn't take care of me or something like that.
Right.
And then, like, I go into, my voice is really, and if I go into, a really poor family, then I'm gonna grow up thinking that I was, like, poor my entire life.
Right.
Like, I'm not gonna know anything about luxury or riches.
Right. Yeah, you don't know any better.
I just don't know any better.
Right. They're more vulnerable. That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
And plus the dependency too. Children are just naturally dependent on adults.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're not as disobedient. That's a great point. Yeah, Raby beat me to it. Yeah, they're just not as, they're hardwired to obey. Right. Okay, so slavery in Europe would be the first recorded in ancient Greece. Most citizens, almost all citizens, would own at least one slave. Right. So you're talking about as many slaves as there are free people. Now, the Spartans would use slavery as a battle tactic. They would capture societies and see their foes turned into slaves, kind of like they did in Helot. Okay, so rather than having their people work, right? So a Spartan in Sparta did not work the fields. They didn't plow the crops. They didn't do any of the hard labor. If you were a Spartan male, what do you think your job was to do?
Make sure that the slaves did their job?
No, let's see. Let me show you. Let me show you an image of the Spartans here.
I don't get it, though.
Okay. And if you've seen the movie 300, you already kind of know. These are what the Spartans look like. What do you think is these guys' professions?
To fight other people?
Yeah,
Make them
yeah.
slaves?
Let me see if I can find it here. That's a great. This is from the movie 300. This is a great scene right here. This is from the movie 300. It's not all that historically accurate because they didn't run around shirtless.
Only the hard and strong may call themselves Spartans. Only the...
Now, it should be of note, the Spartans, what made them so fierce in battle is they had the best battle armor on Earth. I just showed you the picture of the Spartans with the battle armor. I don't know why he chose to have them run around other than to show off their six-packs, but why they're running around with no armor. But other than that, it's fairly accurate, at least to the original story.
We march.
Hold on, let's see if I can find the scene.
Silence.
These are the Arcadians.
Sparta was on the warpath. We were eager to join forces. If it is blood you seek, you're welcome to join us. But you bring only this handful of soldiers against Xerxes. You see, I was wrong to expect Sparta's commitment to at least match our own. Doesn't it? You, there. What is your profession? I'm a potter. And you, Acadian, what is your profession?
Sculptor, sir.
You?
Blacksmith.
Spartans! What is your profession? See, old friend, I brought more soldiers than you did.
I love that line. Oh, that's so good. So yeah, Spartans were soldiers. If you were a male Spartan, you had one job, and that was to be a soldier, right? They didn't have time to plot the fields or labor in blacksmith or pottery or whatever, right? If you're a Spartan, you're a soldier, right? They had slaves for that crap. So that's why they had to go conquer land. The people in Sparta that did the work, those were the slaves. If you were a Spartan male, your job was to learn how to fight, right? And they at the time were the most advanced warriors on earth. And if you want me to do a lesson on the actual story of the Battle of Thermopylae, I'll be happy to do that. It's a really fun. I might do that one. That's a fun topic because it was really an actual event in history. Huh? Yeah. Okay, so Rome would carry on that tradition, and they would even use their slave labor for sport. So they would also go out and conquer land and enslave the people for their labor. But they would use their slaves for sport. And this would be the gladiator matches, right? Where slaves would often be equipped with armor and fight to the death. You know, they didn't have football or basketball. Everybody would go up to the arena, and they would watch the slaves duke it out, sometimes against animals. Like they'd have, 4 or 5 humans come in and see if they can fight a tiger. Right? See how many humans the tiger can kill before it, or sometimes they'd have battle royales. Let me see if I can show it.
Ouch.
Let me see. Let's see. Yeah, so this is a good example of a gladiator battle scene.
Music, you're basically having a conversation.
No, this will be a commercial. So we're going to wait, get rid of this commercial.
Barbarian Hannibal. Ferocious.
And you see, notice the crowds, everybody's watching. And they do these like mock simulated battles. I don't want to show too much because it'll get taken down. By the way, when these two gladiators would do combat, after one of them had defeated the other, the king would show up, the Caesar would show up, and he would decide whether the winner killed the loser. And because it was too loud, you couldn't hear what he was saying, he would walk up, and if he decided, okay, this person fought really well, let him live to see another day, he would do this. But if he did poorly in battle, and he wanted the guy killed, he would do this. And that meant finish him off, right? So today, like when you click on a thumbs up, when you like a post, that's where thumbs up came from.
Maybe like let them rise,
Well, that's like, hey, they're good to go. Let them live. This is kill them. And of course, everybody in the crowd's like, but kill them if they did poorly, or if they did really well, thumbs up. But so like when you see Facebook or something like that, and you see the little thumbs up icon, that's where thumbs up came from. It's from gladiator matches.
Let this meme live.
Yeah. So why do you think gladiator matches were so popular?
It's just their form of entertainment because they didn't have like television.
Could you watch two people go out there and fight and kill each other?
No, I couldn't.
But the funny thing is, even though I wouldn't want to watch it in real life, boy, I love watching it in movies. Like you can get the appeal. I'm not a bloodthirsty person, but you get the appeal, right? Like The Gladiator is one of my favorite movies.
It's like
with Russell Crowe.
It's just drama. Like you want to see like who lives and who dies. Like,
Right.
You see, I'm trying to think of like how to word it.
Well, who didn't love watching the Avengers? You know, when they're killing each other, and you know, I cheered when Thanos died. You know, who didn't love it when? Yeah, they didn't have Netflix. That's great. You know, who didn't cheer when? Spoiler alert! But when Captain America got Mjolnir and then ran up, and started beating the crap out of Thanos, I was like, man, I was so excited, right? So, I think you're right. Like, I think Raby hit the nail on the head. People are, for whatever reason, maybe it goes all the way back to our primal instincts, but people love watching violence, right? It's one of the funniest things is,
see people kill. Like, I like seeing people fight.
I don't know anybody that their favorite show is Cops, but I think we all like watching it. Like, so if I'm sitting there somewhere and Cops is on, even if I'm doing something else, I'm going to start watching it. Right? Because everybody loves watching, like, the crackhead that's resisting arrest or something like that. People are just drawn to the drama, the violence and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think y'all are all hitting the nail on the head. I mean, who doesn't love a good kung fu movie? So, yeah, people are just drawn to violence. And, again, you know, they didn't have Netflix. So if you wanted to get a good taste of violence, the Gladiator games were how you did it.
That's for entertainment. You're not going to, like, sit, like, other than that, the only thing you do all day is sit around in your house. Like,
right.
It's going to get boring.
The most famous of these would be Spartacus. And he would actually rise up. Now, the goal of it was if you won enough matches, you could win your freedom. And Spartacus would be this great gladiator. I don't know how many victories he had, but he had a bunch of victories. And he would rise up, and he would try to lead a rebellion of the gladiators to try to overthrow the government. Now, his rebellion gets wiped out. But he kind of becomes this symbol of give me liberty or give me death type thing. Yeah, bad boys, what you gonna do? That's right. Everybody knows that.
I don't know that.
So why do you think the slaves would follow Spartacus and rebel against the government? Which, by the way, they get wiped out. Yeah, Rachel makes a good point. You know, it used to be very popular for people to watch executions. Whole village would show up and watch somebody get hung. You know.
I thought you were like you were forced to come to that, so like they could. I thought. Like,
but people would bring their kids. You know, sometimes you would see like in the Salem witchcraft trials, whole village show up and just watch somebody get burned at the stake for witchcraft. It's crazy.
Like I thought you had to show up because like they were they would say like this is the rules that they broke, and if you don't, if you break this rule, then this is what your punishment is.
Well, you weren't forced to do, but nobody was twisting arms. You know, there'd be big crowds at a public hanging. Yeah.
Oh, but back to this question. What do you think slaves would? I guess because they wanted their freedom too.
Right. Well, and I think
everybody else's.
I think it kind of was the rise of people following a celebrity. You know, every week they were showing up and watching Spartacus. He became a celebrity, right? And you know, at one point in time, he was more popular than the Caesar. You know, I mean, he was the celebrity of their era. You know, so I think a lot of people were drawn to that charisma of showing up every week and watching him compete. Yeah, and of course, nobody wants to be oppressed. That's right. Slavery was also used by the Scandinavian Vikings. They would often use their slaves as scouts and explorers. So what they do is they capture these slaves and they'd give them boats. And they'd say, okay, we need you to go out and find... And they took relatively good care of their slaves. But go out, find places, and we'll show up and we'll lay waste to the village. Right? So they were kind of like... I don't know how many of y'all are nerdy enough to get this reference. But they were kind of like the Silver Surfer to Galacticus, right?
Oh.
Yeah, so they would be sent out to go find inhabitable places to satiate the Vikings' hunger, kind of like Silver Surfer with Galacticus, right? Go out, find these planets for me to devour, type thing. That type of relationship, right? So why use slaves as scouts? What do you think?
Because, like, if one of their men got caught, then that would be one of their fighting men that they had to give up.
Well, let me tell you this. If you're a Viking, right, you're this big, giant, huge guy with a giant sword and stuff like that. If you show up, you're going to be easy to spot, right? But these slaves, they fit in with the regular common folk. They are regular common folk, right? And it's good for the slaves too, in that imagine if all your job was in life is just to sail over somewhere and go, hey, there's some people here. And then you report back to the Vikings, and then you get to have part of the spoils of war, right? So, it's kind of a mutually beneficial symbiosis, right? And of course, obviously, you want the protection of the Vikings too. If they get caught or hurt, they can be easily replaced. That's another one too. That's why it's good for the Vikings, right? If somebody gets caught or hurt, oh well, it's not one of our people. So it's no harm, no foul for them. Good point.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we go. Now we're going to get into white slavery. You ready for white slaves?
I thought the white slavery was if you were sometimes if you were a good Christian, you would be a slave.
You could be, yeah, right. But
But
these are white as the driven snow, white slaves, right? So the Russians would opt in to use slavery as a means of choice, right? Very much like what I talked about, either people would opt into slavery in return for land when done for providing provisions. However, the system quickly gets abused. And you got people born into slavery, and this is called Russian serfdom. Okay, you're going to see people that are going to get so far in debt they'll never be free, right? So let's say they sign up and they go, okay, I'm going to be a slave for you for 3 years. You provide me with a place to live and the means to feed myself. But the problem is the slave master wouldn't provide you with enough wages to ever leave. So before you know it, you're a slave, your children are slaves, and they get so far into debt, they're going to be slaves for generations, right? And this is white people slaves, right? White people being put as slaves for other white people. And it got to be very much like what you imagine, like go out and work in the field, you got the plantation owner hitting them with the whip, right? That type of slavery, right? Very, very brutal time. In fact, if you were a child born into slavery, there's some really great stories. I had a professor that wrote a book about somebody that was born into slavery and kind of escaped, and his story of trying to go and buy, it was based on a real story, buy other slaves to set them free. But yeah, it was just this weird system where it's you had a slave class of white slaves. And here's the funny thing too. Racism is still not... There's still an issue of racism even today in Russia, right? And it was still back then too. But you did have a few examples of black people owning white slaves. That happened. It wasn't common, but you had black people owning white slaves. So that's a fascinating story. So how do you think Russian serfdom compares to some of those people working here in the U.S., right? Where, you sign up for a job, but it pays such low wages you can't leave. And the thing I kind of think about, and we see this all the time, right? It was really hard for me to leave the restaurant industry. It was so hard. I hated my job. But it paid too good. And I now had bills I couldn't afford if I left. In fact, if it were not for Obama freeing up a lot of money for... Can you figure out what's going on? I'm sorry. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to leave this on center screen. My dogs are freaking out. Maybe it's the weather. Let me check on real fast. Freaking out. Yeah, sorry about that. I think it's the thunder and lightning, but my dogs are freaking out outside. And they're still pacing the house, freaking out. Anyway, so how do you think Russian serfdom compares to people working here? And so I think about it in those terms, right? How many people today are in jobs they cannot stand and they hate, but what are they going to do? They can't quit. And I think about it even today with COVID-19, right? There's a lot of people going to work that they don't want to go to work, but what choice do they have? Is that or starve to death? So I'm kind of curious what y'all think. There's something to be said about wages being kept so low. And here's another one I think about too. In our country, insurance or health care is tied to jobs. So there's a lot of people that maybe they have an illness or a pre-existing condition, and they can't leave their job because if they do, they're going to lose their health care and they're going to die. Maybe they're diabetic. You know, so what do you think, Elizabeth?
Like the 9/11 people
What do you mean?
who got the people who were on the front lines in 9/11.
Oh yeah, we showed that video of them fighting for their health care. Yeah, they couldn't get health care. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's a weird thing too. Yeah, that they have low wages and they get hatred from anyone else. Yeah, and that's another thing too. Like, think about it in those terms of one of the other ways I thought about it too is, I think I read a study somewhere. It was like you were 85% more likely to end up in prison if you had a parent who was in prison, right? So let's say your dad goes out and he gets put in jail for whatever reason. His kid is I think 85% more likely to go to prison themselves. You talk about that, yeah.
They didn't commit a crime.
Well, I know, it's more like because you kind of now are stuck in that life, it's really hard to get out of. And you think about these generational, because I don't think anybody thinks of slavery as or prison is slavery, but in a way it kind of is, like you're still bound. A lot of them are still doing hard labor. It's almost like you're born into that life. You're forced to work even if you don't want to. Now, the next major breakthrough is going to be the age of discovery, right? Spain would discover the New World, and I put that in quotation marks. If you're in my AP class, we did a whole lesson on who really discovered North America. It was not the Spanish.
It was not
right?
Christopher Columbus.
Right, but for whatever reason, when they came and they started colonizing the New World, they wanted to have slaves, right? These conquistadors, they didn't know how to farm the land or live off the land.
No, it makes me so angry. Christopher Columbus didn't discover anything. There were already people living there. He didn't discover anything.
Right. Anyways, so he shows up and he starts taking slaves, right? But they then start to run into this problem. The Europeans, by the way, they would justify slavery, because keep in mind, these are supposedly a Christian people, that it was okay because even though they were slaves, they were being rewarded by being given Christianity, which we talked about was the Encomendia system. Now, they soon found that the natives were very poor slaves, and the reason why is they're dying in mass of disease, right? So, you would staff you would buy these slaves, and then all of a sudden your whole plantation would be out of labor because all the slaves died when one of them got smallpox or, we talked about that Cocolizzi. Yeah, it's hard to leave something once you're into it. That's a great point. So what they would do is they would decide, we need to find a people that are more resistant to disease. And what they found is that the people in sub-Saharan Africa were extremely resistant. When you look at people with the best immunities in human history, the people of sub-Saharan Africa were the pinnacle of the top, right? Partially because of natural selection, right? Sub-Saharan Africa is so rich in biodiversity, but part of that is mosquitoes. So you have the tsetse fly and stuff like that. So diseases would spread, and it forced the people of sub-Saharan Africa to build up these strong immune systems. So they found that the average black person that they found in sub-Saharan Africa, man, they could take anything Mother Nature had to throw them at them. Smallpox, shake it off, right? So they were as far as resistance to things like smallpox, black people in sub-Saharan Africa are the pinnacle of disease resistance.
What about the Black Death? Anybody?
Yeah,
that,
it
right?
never really messed with sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not saying nobody in there got it, but it didn't wipe massive amounts of people out, right? So they would rely on sub-Saharan African trade. Now, it should be of note, here's how this worked. The Dutch would go down there, and they would find these black people that lived near the coast. And the black people that lived near the coast would go and capture. Let me see if I can find it. Roots does a good job of this. If you've ever seen the movie Roots, it does a really good job. I don't want to survey. Skip. don't want to show too much of it, but here you would see slave trade, and you would see black people from the coast going and capturing black people from the interim to sell as slaves. And this is how Kunta Kinte gets captured. Right? So it was that network, right? The Dutch would show up, they would find these black merchants that lived in the coast, and they would go and find the people that lived in the heart of the jungle, so to speak. Yeah, the Dutch. They were the King Daddy slave traders, the Dutch were. So why do you think they would bring in people from Africa, and why do you think people from Africa would be able to deal with the disease better? And I kind of already spoiled this one, but go ahead.
Yeah, the second half of the question is because of mosquitoes.
Yeah, just the biodiversity in sub-Saharan Africa, right? We're talking about one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And unlike the Latin world, right, so you think about the Amazon rainforest, you're like, well, that's got the most biodiversity. Yeah, but it had the fewest amount of humans. So they didn't have any interaction with the outside world to get those diseases to develop an immunity that was spread around by mosquitoes. Africa did not have that luxury, right? Like, they've been messing with Africa since the dawn of time, just about. So they would get the disease, and then the mosquitoes and tsetse flies and stuff would just spread it around. Everybody gets sick, and then the people that survived were born with immunity and powerful immune systems, right, through genetic adaptation. So why do you think they'd bring in people from Africa? And again, I kind of spoiled this one, but they would be the most resistant to these European diseases, right? And of course, it's highly successful. They were the most disease-resistant people on the planet, right? Natural selection. One of the things that's funny, though, is I've had some of my black students that got all, head, shoulders puffed out. It's like, oh, that means I'm resistant to disease. I want to make one thing crystal clear, though. Those are black people from sub-Saharan Africa, and even their children, right? Their children. But I mean, as we saw in COVID-19, unfortunately, we've all been Americanized. So, I mean, if you were a student from Africa, right? Like I've had some from Senegal. I would imagine their immune systems are better than average. But now, generations and generations later, unfortunately, that does not stay holding up, unfortunately, right? So slavery would now decimate the New World as the U.S. would win its independence. Dominate the New World. And this would lead all the way up to the Civil War, which, I'm sure if somebody conservative saw this, they might get angry at me saying this, but it was over slavery. If you read the Articles of Confederation, that's what the people that fought it said. They said it was over slavery. You can get into the nuances of it, but that's what the people that fought it said. So slavery is going to end, and then the next time you're going to see it kind of shift in how it's handled is going to be during the Second World War, right? And this time you're going to see bound labor used for genocide, right? Genocide. So what happens is...
what is genocide?
Genocide is trying to exterminate an entire minority group, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to see Hitler start to round up all the Jews to put them in labor camps. These labor camps are basically death camps is what they turn into. So they say, look, it's for your own protection, Jews. We're going to bring you to these camps. You're going to work. We're going to feed you, and you're going to live off the state. And of course what really happens is they do hard labor, but only until they can build their own facilities to start mass executing them, right? So we're going to see slavery used as a form of genocide, right? Yes, it's despicable and disgusting, right? So Hitler would round up millions of Jews and other minorities too. It's not just Jews, like gypsies and stuff like that. And over time, they would be executed in all manner of horrific ways, right? Mostly gas chambers, incineration, stuff like that, right? So this is where you're going to see bound labor start being used for genocide. So why do you think Hitler would put them in camps rather than just killing them? Why not just kill them right then and there?
Because, if you were just killing them, somebody would have been like, hey, you can't just kill people because they were just people.
There is a great post going around where somebody was using a quote from Hitler to kind of bash the stay-at-home order. And he's basically quoting that there was a sign, I'd have to look it up what it was, but there was a sign they put in these camps, right? And he's basically quoting Hitler saying that, like, in these labor camps they'd have this sign that would say, like, come here and your labor shall set you free, right? That basically they were told this lie of, we're going to protect you from all this hatred against Jews. You show up to these labor camps voluntarily, I might add, and you can work there, and then you'll get your freedom and we'll take care of you. And I think it's because it didn't work often, but it was kind of a trick, at least to help appease. Because keep in mind, if he just started killing Jews in the streets, what do you think all the Jews in Germany would do?
Run away.
Yeah, they all run away, and he don't want that. It's not that he didn't want Jews in Germany. He didn't want Jews, period. Right? One of his main driving factors was not to kill all the Jews in Germany. It was to conquer the world, to kill all the Jews everywhere. Right? So it's almost like he doesn't want them escaping. He doesn't want them getting loose. Right? Let's see. Yeah, to try and make it seem like he was helping them. Right?
On the last slide, you had, like, the caption was like, the slaves in the striped pajamas. There's actually a book.
That's where I got it from. Boy in the striped pajamas. Where do you think I got it from?
I don't know. That's.
By the way, in case you have not picked up on this, and hopefully y'all have, maybe you picked up on all year. I love making witty little captions at the top of my presentations. So, like, if you go back through it, the slave in the striped pajamas, it's kind of a play on words, the boy in the striped pajamas. Back to the beginning. Slavery in the New World. I try to let them fight. It's kind of a play on the Godzilla. Let them fight.
What's the beat kick?
This is Sparta was from the movie This is Sparta. Anyway, I try to be witty in those little things.
Yeah, if you scroll up in the comments, man.
Yeah. Okay, so after the fall of the Nazis, there would be a large coup d'etat. Where the government is overthrown in Argentina. And they would actually bring in a lot of Nazi labor camp people to set up concentration camps in Argentina. This time they called them little schools. And they tried to act like, okay, well, we're just going to take all these liberals and we're taking them to re-educate them, right? And of course they never showed back up. Right, so they're just basically capturing political prisoners and putting them to death in these labor camps. And when I talked about it in U.S. history, we kind of go over it, and I do it in a geography class. There's a book, this one right here, that I actually had a signed copy from the author, and I got to find it. I think it's up at school. But anyway, it's called The Little Schools, and she's a first-hand account of a survivor of this, and the horrible ways in which they torture them to death. I mean, it'll make your blood boil. It's almost a horror story. But anyway, they're called little schools to make them sound better. And really to stop the international community from fooling with them. Today, slavery is actually bigger than it has ever been in history. And that may blow your mind. There are more slaves walking around right now than at any point in history. Right? So we talk about slavery in America. It's like, oh, well, that happened back in plantation days, and we fought the Civil War, and slavery ended. It did not end, right? I want to make that crystal clear. There are more slaves now than at any point in history. That's mind-blowing, right? Slavery today, though, is not some guy out working in cotton field with some slave plantation owner, right? Now it is human trafficking, right? That's the largest cause. There is still some slave labor, like you see kids in the diamond mines in the Congo, right? That's slave labor. I mean, you can put window dressing on slave labor, right? But now it is for sex slavery mostly. Over 40 million people are slaves walking around right now. Right now on this earth, 40.3 million victims of slavery. Right now. Okay? Of these, 24.9 million are exploited for labor. 15.4 million are used for forced marriage. And there are 5.4 victims of modern slavery for every 1,000 people in the world. So every 1,000 people on the planet, 5.4 victims of them are slaves. So what are some ways you think we can think of to stop human trafficking? What are some ways you can think of that we can fight human trafficking?
Pepper spray.
Yeah, pepper spray. But let's think of it in a bigger scale. How can we stop human trafficking? Can you think of any ideas?
No, not really. I don't know though, cause like.
How do you think people are human trafficked? How do you think that happens?
Like, they. Ooh, I know one way. You can you don't meet up with people that you meet on the internet.
Yeah, that could be one.
You really don't. Like, you say like.
Yeah, pay
you
attention to
meet
missing kid pictures. That's a good one.
You look online and you meet someone. Don't meet up with them in real life because they could be 40 years old and kidnap you.
One of the things I always tell my students is international travel is one of the most fun things you will ever do in your life.
Never get in cabs.
Okay? It is so much fun. And I always encourage everybody to travel this world. This world is so big and so beautiful, and there's so much fun things to do. I cannot express enough. If you ever get a chance, I would encourage every person listening to dedicate yourself to try to travel the world at some point in time in your life. Make that a goal, right? Because it is, to me, one of the greatest tragedies in life is for somebody to be born, raised, and died having never left their own country. It's so sad, right? And it gets addictive. The more you travel, the more you're going to want to, right? It's the most fun I've ever had in my life is leaving this country and traveling this planet. However, be careful, right? If you're a girl and you're at the club and a really attractive guy starts hitting on you, do not go home with him.
Don't talk to him.
Don't go home with him, right? I know you're on vacation. He seems like a nice guy, but that's how they get you. And I think we've all seen this movie.
Is there anything else you want to tell me?
Okay, she met somebody at the club and they followed her home. Now this is in France. It's not heavily a problem in France, but it does happen there.
What? What are you talking about? All right, listen to me.
Oh, God.
Did you meet anyone on the plane?
No.
In the airplane?
No. Yes, Peter.
Peter who? Mary? Did he know where you were staying?
He's in a cab with us. I'm scared.
I know you are. Stay focused, Kimmy. You have to hold it together. How many people are there? Be precise.
3, 4, I don't know.
Where are you?
I'm in the bathroom.
Go to the next bedroom. Get onto the bed.
Okay, I don't want to play the whole thing because it's going to get me kicked off. But if you've ever seen the movie Taken, it's a great scene of how somebody can get abducted, right? And that happens all the time, right? You know, the I will find you, I will kill you, that's that whole thing. Now, today we're seeing huge strides. Let me see some of the comments. Don't trust someone easily. Norali says she wants to travel the world. Please do, Norali. You're going to love it. Be careful of strangers. Stop the black market in the dark web. Yeah, that's something we're really trying to fight. Don't take drinks or food from strangers. A lot of spring breaker kids get kidnapped. That's absolutely true. Today we're seeing huge strides in the use of technology. I'm glad Mr. Ray pointed that out. Through a government/private company collaboration. If you know who Ashton Kutcher is, the guy from That 70s Show, he did some other little rinky-dink movies. He's actually got an organization called Thorn, which is it's to be like a play on words, to be a thorn in the side of human trafficking. I think that's how it came from anyway. But Thorn is like this huge program, and it relies off private funding and government working with the governments to try to work together to end human trafficking, particularly of children, right? So it kind of gets on the dark web and goes through and finds the people that are engaged in it.
And like every single rest stop you stop in, like whenever you're like whenever we're going like Alabama or something like that, like all the rest stops like that, like from Louisiana to
in human trafficking.
Yeah, like on the bathroom stalls, they'll have like to, if you are a victim or know someone who is a victim of human trafficking, call this number.
Right.
It's like a 1-800 number.
And this is something, if you ever travel and you ever do go out and you're female, and shoot, I would suggest this for anybody that even goes to a club or something. But this is kind of a fascinating
nail polish. I'm talking about women here. Color is usually the most important factor. Is it going to match what I'm wearing? But now a group of young inventors say their nail polish could keep you from becoming a victim of date rape.
Sounds crazy, but they say it is able to detect if your drink is spiked by simply dipping your finger in the drink. Fox 10's Mark Martinez live tonight with how this works. Mark.
Yeah, John Kerry, this nail polish is not yet on the market, but already the college students who've invented it, they are getting a lot of attention. They're also getting a lot of money to get this product on store shelves. They say it's a simple and discreet way for women to find out if their drink has been spiked with a date rape drug. Picking out the perfect nail polish may soon be about more than just looks. It could help you from becoming the victim of a date rape. Thanks to an experimental nail polish called Undercover Colors. The makers say it can tell you if your drink has been spiked with a date rape drug. You simply dip your finger into a drink, and if the polish changes color, it means someone has slipped you something. It's the invention of these 4 North Carolina State University students who've been working on the line for the past year.
It is a good measure of prevention. However, the message that we should be sending people is not to rape each other.
Yeah, obviously we don't want people raping each other. That's not good. But hey, that's a good idea that I always kind of promote as a possible way to help fight human trafficking. Okay. Well, listen, that's it. So we're now all caught up. I've gone through the entire genesis of the beginning to modern. Boy, it's getting really dark. We don't have the light coming in through. But anyway, we've gone through the entire genesis of bound labor up to modern bound labor, right? So my kind of thing for y'all is, do y'all have any questions, any comments? Maybe it's about this lesson. Maybe it is about school, anything like that. Yeah, if you do, go ahead and leave them in the show notes. Yeah, that's it. Well, listen, thank y'all so much for showing up and participating in your education. Thank you for your dedication to your education.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for showing up. I appreciate y'all so much. Yeah, so let's see. Is there a 4th 9 weeks? So what we've been told to do is copy the 3rd 9 weeks grade into the 4th 9 weeks. So basically you're just going to have a semester grade is what it amounts to. So I'm still entering grades, but I'm entering them in the 3rd 9 weeks. And then I'm just going to copy that over into the 4th 9 weeks. If that makes sense.
So, 3rd.
Yeah.
To 4th.
Please do Spartan history. Okay, I'll do particularly the Battle of Thermopylae. That's a pretty good one.
3rd.
Anything else? Any other questions?
You need to watch the Mr. Nicky thing because it talks a lot about Hammurabi's code.
Okay, I'll have to check that out.
You would like it?
All
You
right.
use it in one of your videos.
Well, if y'all have no more questions, as always, thank you for your dedication to your education, and goodbye. Oh, so teacher can't put in new grades. That is not true. I'm sorry. Before I sign out. Yes, we can put in new grades. All this enrichment stuff, I'm putting it in as a 10 out of 0. So it's all sweet bonus. If you have an A, I'm going to give those grades to Bradford, and that's going to transfer over to you in the 11th grade, 12th grade. So all this work you're out doing for enrichment is actually going to help you next year if you have an A, which I think you do, Nirali. So yeah, so this is actually bonus work for 12th grade. So I hope that, and by the way, thank Nirali for that. She's the one that got that ball rolling. So all right. So unless y'all have any other questions, yeah, for real this time. Thank you for your dedication, education, and